On the morning of the 4th of September, 1878, a woman who called herself Hattie Cole hired on as cook to a trail outfit pushing 600 head north out of the Pecos country, and she did it without once taking off her right glove. She kept it on to shake hands with the trail boss. She kept it on to count the coins he laid in her palm. The other hand, the bare one, she used for everything a cook uses a hand for. But the right stayed in that worn doeskin glove, soft as a second skin, the seam at the wrist sewn twice over, and a man would have to be looking for it to notice that she never let it be seen. Silas Wren was not looking for it. He was looking at her wagon. "You drive that yourself," he said. He was a big man, gone to grey at the temples, with the kind of face that had spent 40 years deciding it was right about most things. "Chuck wagon's no small rig. Most cooks I take on, they can't back a 4-mule team into a creek crossing without spilling the whole works." "I can back it into a creek crossing," she said. That was all. She did not tell him she had driven a chuck wagon down the Chisholm in '73, or that she had cooked for 30 men through a blue norther up on the Red River and lost none of them to the cold. She had learned, by the autumn of '78, that the less a woman explained on the frontier, the less there was to be checked. Wren squinted at her. "You're a widow." "I am." "Cole. That a Texas name?" "It's the name I go by," she said, and she let him make of that what he wanted, because the truth was a thing she had stopped offering to men with hiring power. Her name had been Margaret once. Margaret Doyle, of a sod house on the Solomon River, daughter of an Irishman who could not read and a mother who could, and who had taught her girl to read by the light of a tallow dip and to pray in a language the neighbours took for witchcraft. Then she had married, and her name had changed, and then it had changed again, into something she did not say aloud and would not write down. "Pays $1 a day," Wren said. "Cook eats first, sleeps when he can. You answer to me and to nobody else. We lose a man to bad meat, I dock you." "You won't lose a man to my cooking." He almost smiled. He did not quite. "Get your fire going then. We move at first light tomorrow." I have seen the wage ledger from that drive. It survives in a county archive in New Mexico, water-stained and bound with a leather thong, and the entry for the cook reads, in Wren's own cramped hand, "H. Cole, $1 a day, paid Fort Stanton." $1 a day was good money. People who have read too many cheap novels imagine the trail cook as a figure of fun, a fat man in a greasy apron, the butt of the outfit's jokes. The truth is nearer the opposite. The cookie ranked second only to the trail boss. He drew higher pay than any rider. He owned the wagon, the medicines, the day's order of march, and the temper of 30 hungry men. And a wise cattleman never crossed his cook, because a cook who has been crossed can ruin a drive without ever raising his voice. Hattie Cole knew exactly what she had hired on to be. She had been it before. What Silas Wren did not know, that 4th of September, was what was burned into the palm of the right hand she kept gloved. She got her fire going. A chuck wagon at dusk is its own small country. She set the wagon box square to the wind, dropped the chuck box lid into its swung-down table, and laid out the day's working tools the way her own first cook had laid them out for her, 20 years gone. The Dutch ovens nested by size, the coffee in the big 2-gallon pot, the sourdough keg lashed where the sun would not turn it. The men drifted in as the light went copper and then went out. They watched her the way men always watched a new cook, and the way they watched a woman, which were two different kinds of watching, and she fed them through both. There were 11 of them, not counting Wren and the horse wrangler, mostly young. One greybeard named Pruitt, who chewed in silence and looked at her a beat too long. And the wrangler. The wrangler came in last, because the wrangler always eats last, after the remuda is settled. He was a lean man, maybe 35, with a flat-brimmed hat pushed back and the bandana still up over the lower half of his face from the dust of the day's work. He took his plate without a word. He hunkered down on his heels at the edge of the firelight where a careful man sits, with his back to nothing and his eyes on everything, and he ate. His name was Tom Early. She would not learn it for 2 days. What she noticed about him first was not his face, which was half hidden, and not his manners, which were good in the spare way of a man raised hard. What she noticed was that when she ladled the stew, he watched her hands. Both of them, the bare one and the gloved one. He watched the way she favoured the right, the way she turned it so the palm never showed, the way she lifted the heavy Dutch oven lid with the bare left hand, even when the right would have been closer. And he said nothing, and he looked away before she could decide whether she had imagined it. A man who watches your hands is a man who has read a wanted bill. She had learned that too. "Stew's good," he said, when he brought his plate back. The bandana was down now. His face was ordinary and weathered, and gave away nothing. "Better than good. Where'd you cook before?" "Here and there." "Here and there's a long trail." "It is," she agreed, and took his plate, and that was the end of it. That night she slept under the wagon with the canvas pulled down on the windward side, and she did not sleep much because she never did the first night with a new outfit, and because under the rolled blanket that served her for a pillow was a Smith & Wesson Schofield revolver, the one with the lighter spring, the break top a woman could thumb open one-handed, and her bare left hand lay on the grip of it the whole night through. The drive she had hired onto belonged, on paper, to a cattleman named Asa Goolsby of Tom Green County, Texas. 600 head, road-branded for the trail, bound for the Army beef contract at Fort Stanton, where the post quartermaster fed the garrison and supplied the Mescalero Agency rations. 400 miles and better north and west across some of the driest going in the territory. That was what Wren had told her. That was what the bill of sale in the wagon strongbox said. She did not look in the strongbox the first day. She did not look the second. She had no business in the strongbox, and a cook who goes through her employer's papers is a cook looking to be hanged. But on the morning of the third day, while the herd strung out long and slow across a flat the colour of old bone, a steer broke from the drag and cut back past the wagon, close enough that she saw its left hip plain. She had been reading brands since before she could properly read words. Her father had run a few head of his own on the Solomon, and a brand, he had told her, was the only signature a man like him would ever own. And you learned to read another man's signature the way you learned to read his eyes. The brand on that steer's hip was a rocking G, Goolsby's road brand, the one that matched the papers, and under it, not quite covered, where an iron had been laid a second time over an older mark to change it, was the ghost of the first brand. She knew that ghost. It was a bar D, a bar over a D. And she knew it the way you know the sound of your own name called across a dark street, because she had worn it herself, burned into the meat of her right palm. For 3 years, 3 months, and a number of days she had stopped counting, and the man who had burned it there had been hanged for it in the spring of '75, and his name had been Daniel Cole, and on the wanted bills that still, for all she knew, travelled this country, folded in the saddlebags of men like Pruitt and men like Tom Early, he was called Dan Coyle, and the woman who rode with him was described as fair, of medium height, Irish, and bearing on her right hand the burned mark of his brand. She let the steer go back to the herd. She kept her face still. She had 3 years of practice at keeping her face still. But her bare left hand, where it rested on the wagon seat, closed slowly into a fist, and the gloved right hand lay in her lap and did not move at all. And somewhere ahead of her, 400 miles of dry country between her and the only place this drive was going, a man named Silas Wren was pushing 600 head of cattle north under a brand that had been laid over the brand of a hanged man. Her hanged man. And there was no road back the way she had come. That night she served the stew, and she counted the men, and she watched the grey-beard Pruitt watch her, and she thought, he is reading me the way I read that steer. And she thought, the wrangler already has. And she made a decision that everyone in that outfit, had they known of it, would have called the act of a woman who had lost her mind. She decided to stay on the drive. She set the coffee pot on the coals for the morning, and she banked the fire, and she lay down under the wagon with her hand on the Schofield, and she did not run. The pressure came from the sky first. On the 5th day, the wind shifted to the northwest and brought down a wall of dust that turned noon into a brown dusk. And the herd grew nervous, and a nervous herd is a cook's enemy as much as any rider's, because a cook works ahead of the drive and stops where she is told, and not 1 yard sooner. Hattie Cole pulled the wagon to a flat above a dry wash where Wren pointed, and she got a fire lit in the lee of the chuck box with her back to the wind and her hat tied down under her chin, and she fed 30 men in a gale, and she did not lose the fire, and she did not lose the coffee, and the grey-beard Pruitt, taking his plate from her, said through the grit in his teeth, "You been on a lot of drives, Mrs. Cole." "Some." "More than some, I'd say." He did not move off with his plate the way the others did. He stood there in the blowing dust with his eyes on her gloved hand. Man learns to cook in a gale. He learned it somewhere hard. "Where'd you say you cooked?" "I didn't." "No," Pruitt said. "You didn't." And he took his plate and went, and Hattie watched his back, and she understood that the thing she had been afraid of since the 3rd day had a face now, and the face was old and patient and was in no hurry, which was the worst kind. If you came here for stories of women who carried a recipe book in one hand and a Schofield in the other, and who paid for their own names twice over before the country would let them keep one, the small button beneath this video keeps those stories coming. That is all I will ask of you. Now, back to the dust. She did not sleep that night either, but it was not Pruitt who kept her awake. A young drover named Beck had burned his hand badly that afternoon, snatching a coffee pot off the coals bare-handed when the wind kicked sparks into the remuda and every other man was busy with the horses. He had not said anything. Trail hands do not say anything, as a rule, about pain that will not kill them. It is a point of a certain hard pride. But by full dark, the hand had blistered white and yellow across the palm, and he could not close it. And the boy was 19, and trying not to let his face show what the hand was doing to him. And Hattie saw it when he came back for his second cup, and could not grip the tin. "Sit down," she said. "It's nothing, ma'am." "Sit down." He sat. She had a tin of axle grease and a tin of lard and a clean flour sack she kept for exactly this, because a trail cook is the nearest thing to a doctor most outfits ever carry, and she had set more burns and bound more cuts and drawn more thorns than she could name. She worked by the low light of the banked fire, away from the others, and she took the boy's ruined hand in her 2 hands to clean it, and she used both of them, because you cannot dress a burn one-handed, and the doe-skin glove on her right hand could not do the close work. And the boy was watching her face and not her hands, the way a hurt child watches the face of whoever is hurting him for his own good. So she took off the glove. She did it the way you do a thing you have decided not to think about, quickly, in the dark, where only the boy could see, and she dressed his hand with both of her own, and her own right palm in the firelight bore, plain as a printed word, the scar of a brand, a bar over a D. The keloid had gone smooth and pale with the years, but the shape did not lie. A brand is built to outlast the hide it is burned into, and it had outlasted 3 years of her trying to forget it. The boy looked at it. He was 19 and in pain, and he looked at her hand and then at her face, and Hattie waited for the thing that always came, the recoil, the question, the word. "My uncle had a mark like that," Beck said, "on his shoulder. He got took by a brand fight when he was young, fell against a hot iron, hurt him his whole life." He winced as she wrapped the sacking. "Did yours hurt you, Mum, when it took?" She had not expected kindness. She had armoured herself against everything but kindness, and it went through her the way the dust went through the canvas, into every seam. "It did," she said. "Once, a long time ago." "It's a clean scar now," the boy said, trying to give her something for the pain she was sparing him. "My uncle's never went clean." She finished his hand. She told him to keep it greased and out of the dirt, and to come to her at every meal so she could look at it. And she put the glove back on, and the boy went off to his blankets, cradling the bound hand against his chest. And Hattie Cole sat by the banked fire with both hands in her lap, the gloved and the bare, and for the first time in 3 years she had let another living soul see the thing Daniel Cole had done to her. And the soul had been a 19-year-old boy who thought it was an accident with an iron, and who had been sorry it hurt. It is the only account I have, from any source, of Margaret Doyle showing that hand to anyone in those years. The boy Beck told it himself, decades later, to a man collecting recollections of the New Mexico cattle trade, and he never knew what the brand had really been, or whose, and he told it only as proof that the cook on the Goolsby Drive had been a kind woman who fixed his hand in the dark. The records on the rest of it are thin, but that part I am sure of, because a man does not invent a detail he does not understand. What Daniel Cole had been, she had learned slowly, and then all at once, the way you learn the worst things. She had married him in 71, believing him a cattle buyer. He was charming the way a certain kind of thief is charming, and he was good to her for the better part of a year, and by the time she understood that the cattle he bought were cattle no one had sold him, she was a thief's wife in a country that hanged thieves, and there was no court in the territory that would have heard the difference between a woman who had married a rustler and a woman who had ridden with one. The Bar D was his brand. He registered it honestly at the county seat, the way a clever rustler does, so that he could lay it over other men's marks and ride into any town with papers that matched his iron. And one night in the autumn of 74, with a posse's lanterns coming up the draw, and the both of them 3 minutes from being taken, he had pressed the running iron, still red from the last steer, flat against her open palm, and held it there while she screamed into his shoulder and said, "So they'll know whose you are, if they take you, and not me." They took him in the end, and not her. She had gotten to the horses. He had not. They hanged him from a cottonwood on the Double Mountain Fork in April of 75, with 11 other men watching and a justice of the peace reading the territorial statute aloud first, because even a hanging wants its forms. And Margaret Doyle had been 40 miles away by then, riding north with a brand on her hand and a dead man's name to outrun. She had thrown away the name. She could not throw away the hand. And now, 4 years on, and 400 miles from where she had buried Margaret Doyle under a cook's apron, she was driving a chuck wagon for an outfit that was running 600 head of cattle, wearing her dead husband's brand under a thin coat of someone else's iron. It was not possible. And then she made herself look at it straight, the way she had made herself look at the steer, and she saw that it was not only possible, but plain. Daniel Cole had not been the only man working the Bar D. A registered brand does not die with the man who owns it. It is property, like a wagon or a name, and it can be bought and sold and stolen and used by whoever holds the iron. Somewhere between the Double Mountain Fork and the Pecos, somebody had gotten hold of Daniel Cole's old running iron, or made a new one to match it, and had spent 3 years building a herd the way Daniel had built his. A few head here, a few there, the marks all changed to match honest papers, and now that somebody was moving the whole accumulated theft north to a government contract, where 600 head would be counted once, paid for once, and scattered into the Indian agency beef issue, where no original owner would ever see his stock again. She did not yet know it was Wren. She suspected it was Wren. A trail boss who owns nothing can be hired by anyone, but a trail boss who pulls his cook aside on the second night to ask, too casually, whether she had ever heard the name Coyle. That was a different thing, and Wren had done exactly that, and she had said no, and watched him decide whether to believe her. The pressure then was this. She knew what the herd was. She could not prove it without giving up who she was, because the only living person who could read the bar D under the rocking G as surely as she could was the woman it had been burned into. And the only people who would care to hear it, the law at Fort Stanton, the army quartermaster who held the beef contract, were 400 miles ahead, on the far side of a man named Pruitt, who was reading her a little more clearly at every meal, and a man named Wren, who had asked about Coyle. The moment of revelation came on the 9th night, and it came in the worst possible form, which is to say, it came from the wrong man's mouth. They had made the Pecos crossing that day, the herd swimming the brown water in a long, bawling line, and the outfit was tired and easy around a good fire for once, and the talk turned, as trail talk does, to old crimes and old hangings. Pruitt told a story. He told it well, the way a man tells a story he has been carrying a while and waiting to set down. "Knew a man got hanged on the Double Mountain Fork," Pruitt said. "Back in '75. Rustler. Went by Coyle. Dan Coyle." He let it sit. He was not looking at Hattie. He was looking at the fire, and that was how she knew he was looking at nothing else. Had a wife rode with him. They never caught her. Bills went out on her all over the territory. Fair woman, Irish, medium height. And here's the thing folks remembered. He turned his head, slow, and now he was looking at her across the fire, and so was every man in the outfit, because a good storyteller turns his audience's head for them. Coyle burned his own brand into her hand, right hand, so's anybody'd know whose she was. A bar over a D. The fire popped. Somewhere out in the dark, the herd shifted and settled. Hattie Cole stood 3 feet from Silas Wren with a coffee pot in her gloved right hand, and she filled Pruitt's cup, and her hand did not shake, and she said, in the flat, dry voice of a woman who has heard 1,000 trail stories and found them all the same, "More coffee, Mr. Pruitt, or have you had your fill?" And she moved on down the line, pouring, and the men laughed, a little, the way men laugh to break a thing they don't understand, and the story died there at the fire, as such stories do. But Tom Early, hunkered at the edge of the light, with his plate balanced on his knee, did not laugh. He watched her pour with the gloved hand, the steady gloved hand, and then he looked down into his coffee, and he said nothing at all. And Hattie understood 2 things in that moment with perfect clarity. The first was that Pruitt did not yet know. He suspected. He was casting his line. The story had been bait, and she had not risen to it, and now he would watch the glove the way a cat watches a hole. The second was that Tom Early already knew, and had known, perhaps, since the first night by the firelight when he watched her hands, and that for some reason of his own, in his own silence, he had decided not to say. That night, banking the fire, she found a folded square of paper tucked under the coffee pot, where only she would find it. She opened it by the last of the coals. It was a page torn from a tally book, and on it, in a careful, uneducated hand, was written one line. Wren sends a rider to Stanton ahead of the herd. Day after tomorrow. Ask yourself why a man hurries to the law he's bringing stolen beef to. There was no name on it. There did not need to be. She held it over the coals until it caught, and she watched the line burn. And she stood up in the cold dark, with the Schofield heavy under her apron and the brand cool and silent in its glove. And she made the second decision that everyone in that outfit, had they known of it, would have called madness. She would get to Fort Stanton before Wren's rider did, and she would do it as herself. She did not run for Fort Stanton in the night the way a desperate woman would have, because a desperate woman is exactly what Wren would be watching for. She did something harder. She stayed at her wagon, and she cooked breakfast, and she planned. A chuck wagon goes ahead of the herd. That was the whole of her advantage, and she built everything on it. The cook breaks camp before dawn and drives ahead to the next nooning ground and has the fire lit and the meal started by the time the herd comes up. The cook is, by the nature of the work, the one person in the outfit whose job is to be in front, alone, out of sight of the drag for hours at a stretch. Wren's rider would leave the next morning and ride hard and straight and reach Fort Stanton in 2 days. The wagon could not outrun a single rider, but the wagon was already going where the rider was going, and the wagon was expected to be ahead, and a wagon that arrived at Fort Stanton half a day early with a worn-out team would raise no questions at all. She would not race the rider. She would arrive looking like she belonged. The thing she needed, she did not have, and that was proof a stranger would believe. Her hand was proof to her. It was a scar to anyone else, and a woman walking into an army post showing a scar and a story was a woman who would be held while they sent a wire, and a wire would reach the wrong people. She needed the brand under the brand. She needed a steer. So on the 11th morning, in the grey before light, while the outfit slept and the night herder sang low to the cattle a quarter-mile off, Margaret Doyle did the only act of rustling in her life. She cut one steer out of the bedded herd, a quiet old lead steer she had been feeding scraps to since the Pecos, who knew her and did not bawl, and she walked it on a soft rope behind the chuck wagon as she pulled out ahead, and when she was 3 miles on and over a rise and alone with the dawn, she stopped and she threw and tied the steer the way her father had taught her on the Solomon, and she looked one more time at the left hip in good light to be sure. A rocking G. And under it, where the iron had been laid twice, the bar D, plain as her own hand. She had no way to take the hide. She had something better. From the chuck box, she took the thing a cook always carries and no one ever thinks to wonder at, a stick of marking chalk and the tally book in which she recorded the day's beef and bread. She made a rubbing. She laid the page over the brand and rubbed the chalk across it, the high scar of the keloid skin taking the chalk and the smooth hide leaving it, the way a child takes a rubbing of a coin, and the 2 brands came up on the paper one over the other, the honest rocking G and the dead man's bar D beneath it, and she dated the page, and she signed it, and for the first time in 4 years she signed it with her own name. Margaret Doyle. Below it she wrote what the bar D was, and whose it had been, and how she knew. Then she let the old steer up, and it shook itself and walked back toward the herd, looking for its scraps, and she drove on. She reached Fort Stanton on the 13th day, the wagon dusty and ordinary, half a day ahead of the herd as a good cook should be, and a full day ahead of Wren's rider, who had taken the long, dry cut-off to spare his horse and lost the time she had counted on his losing. What happened at the fort I can tell with more confidence than the rest, because it left paper. She did not go to the soldiers. A woman with no name they knew, telling a story about a hanged rustler 4 years dead, would have spent a week in a holding room. She went instead to the one man on a government post whose whole profession was the reading of brands, the contract beef inspector, a Scotsman named Alexander Frame, whose job under the post contract was to receive, count, and certify every head delivered, and who had certified more cattle than any man in the territory, and who had testified in brand cases before. I have read his deposition. It is dry and exact, and entirely without romance, which is why I trust it. She laid the chalk rubbing on his table. She did not tell him who she was, not at first. She told him what he was looking at, and she invited him to disbelieve her and to go read the steers himself when the herd came up. And she named the steer, the old lead, the gentle one, by the chip out of its left horn. Frame went out when the herd came up that afternoon, and he read the lead steer's hip, and then he read 9 more at random, and he found the bar D under the rocking G on 6 of the 10, and he impounded the herd pending inquiry, which, under the contract, he had the plain authority to do, and Silas Wren was arrested at Fort Stanton 3 days later when the inquiry found that the bill of sale from Asa Goolsby was a forgery, and that Goolsby, when wired, had sold Wren no cattle at all, and had been wondering for a year where his own strays were going. The running iron was found in Wren's bedroll. It was an old iron, worn, the kind a man keeps a long time. Whether it had been Daniel Cole's own, passed hand to hand among rustlers, across 3 years and 400 miles, the way such tools are passed, or only a twin of it, made to work the same registered brand, Frame's deposition does not say, and I will not pretend to know. The records on that point are thin, but I have stood in the archive at Santa Fe and held the page Margaret Doyle made that morning with chalk and a cook's tally book, and the 2 brands are there, one over the other, and at the bottom is her name in a small, steady hand, the first time she had written it in 4 years, and the ink is the cheap kind sold at frontier sutlers' stores, and the testimony is not. It was Frame who asked her, in the inquiry, how she could be so certain of a brand 4 years dead. And it was there, in an army office at Fort Stanton, with a Scotsman and a lieutenant and a clerk taking down every word, that Margaret Doyle took off her right glove in front of men for the second time in 4 years, and the first time by choice in the light of day, and laid her open palm flat on the table. "Because I wore it," she said. "He burned it into me the night before they took him. I am the wife they never caught. My name is Margaret Doyle, and I have not said it aloud since April of '75, and I will say it now, under oath, and you may do with me what the law says you must." The clerk's pen stopped. The lieutenant looked at the hand and then at the inspector. And Alexander Frame, who had read 10,000 brands and never one like this, looked a long moment at the bar over the D burned into a living woman's hand, and then he wrote in his record the line that closed the matter, the line I have read more than once and that improves on each reading. The mark on the witness's hand corresponds in every particular to the brand impounded. The witness is the brand's best evidence. I find no charge that the